Next up, we have Pascal Hagley, and this is a guy who probably needs very little introduction to many of you. He's originally from Switzerland, but he's currently over here in Canada as a professor with Simon Fraser University, where he holds the National Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada Industrial Research Chair in Avalanche Risk Management. I dare you to say that 5 times fast. He manages a really talented team of 10 graduate students with diverse areas of expertise. And he conducts applied research, I think, where the real magic happens, at that kind of complicated intersection of the social sciences and the natural sciences. And he has a lofty goal of helping recreationists and avalanche professionals make better decisions when traveling in avalanche terrain. So here he is to let us know how we can make our avalanche bulletins more effective. Pascal?
Pascal, you're muted.
That will help. Thanks.
Perfect.
Okay, hello everybody. Thanks for the introduction, Jen, and thanks to everybody for tuning in. I'll use the next 15 to 20 minutes to talk about the research on avalanche bulletin users that my research group and I have been conducting since the last ISSW. Unfortunately, I won't have time to get into the details of each study, but I will provide an overview of the key results and draw some overarching conclusions on how this research might help to make us the bulletins more effective. So let's get right into it. To help recreationalists make informed travel decisions, avalanche bulletins need to master 2 communication transactions. First, forecasters need to convert the available information about current conditions into an accurate conditions report. And second, recreationalists need to be able to take this information and turn it into meaningful decisions about when and where to go into the backcountry. Over the last few years, there's been several studies that have examined the forecasting process, but targeted research focusing on how end users interpret the bulletin information is much more sparse. So the objective of our research program is to contribute to this area by providing tangible answers to the following questions. How do recreationalists use, understand, and apply bulletin information? Does the provided information match with users' needs and expectations? And what are common hurdles and challenges? Our goal is to produce results that can highlight opportunities and offer actionable insights for improving the effectiveness of the bulletin. Our research program is organized in 3 main phases. We started with qualitative interviews to get a first overview of how people use avalanche bulletins. We then conducted a large-scale online survey to examine the observed patterns in a larger sample. And in phase 3, we started to explore possibilities for making avalanche bulletins more effective. Now, in this presentation, I'll briefly touch on the results of 4 specific analyses that we've been working on over the last 2 years. Let's start with Anne Sinclair's qualitative study on bulletin user types. So to get started on this topic, Anne and Henry together conducted 48 semi-structured interviews that included several practical exercises to stimulate a conversation around bulletin use. We put considerable effort into making sure that we had a diverse range of interviewees that included recreationalists who barely knew that the bulletin existed, to keeners who read it like a newspaper every day. After months of transcribing all interviews, Anne used thematic analysis to identify patterns in the data in a systematic way. And here is what her analysis revealed. She found 5 distinct bulletin use patterns that can be organized in a hierarchy. Very briefly, the 5 levels are type A's, who simply don't use the bulletin for a variety of reasons. Type B's, who decide whether to go into the backcountry or not simply based on the danger rating. type Cs who also focus on the danger rating, but combine it with their knowledge of terrain to make informed choices about where to go. Type Ds who are the first to integrate avalanche problems, but rely on the bulletin as their main information source. And type Es who use the bulletin information as a starting point, but validate the assessment with their own observations. Anne's work provides several important take-home messages. First, it's important to realize that depending on context, each of these use patterns is a completely valid approach for managing avalanche risk. For example, if you're a snowshoer only staying on marked trails, just using the danger rating is probably an appropriate way to manage the risk. The typology also points out what components of the bulletin are most relevant for the different user groups and how they use them. This highlights that the different bulletin components really need to be designed with those users in mind. The danger rating really needs to work for the Bs and Cs who rely on it the most, while we can use other parts of the bulletin to communicate to Ds and Es. Last but not least, Anne found an interesting link to an existing taxonomy in the education literature that offers valuable insight about how to facilitate the progression towards processing more complex information. I think Anne's typology is a really important first step for better understanding our users and how to better match our bulletin products to their needs and practices. Now, the obvious next question is whether recreationalists who say they use the bulletin in a specific way actually have the skills they need to use it effectively at that level. To answer this question, Henry Finn conducted an extensive online survey in the spring of 2019. Early on in the survey, we included a series of statements that allowed participants to self-identify their bulletin user type. We then followed up with basic recall questions and more advanced comprehension questions to test participants' understanding of the bulletin parts at different levels. The core of the survey was an application question where participants were given a complete bulletin and an idealized mountainscape where they had to assess which slopes are acceptable for travel under the given conditions. Henry then derived the bulletin user type specific grading scheme for assessing participants' performance on these questions. This means that we expected Ds to use more advanced information and make assessments at a higher level than Cs and Bs, for example. Now, what did Henry find? In general, the performance in the recall and comprehension questions was quite high, but more than half of the participants failed to give a reasonable response in the slope choice question at their level. This really highlights that while participants knew what the individual concepts meant, putting them together into a decision was much more challenging. Henry also looked at how participants' backgrounds relate to their performance. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time here to go into this in detail, but some of the most interesting insight is that while formal avalanche training had a positive effect, as expected, years of backcountry experience did not. So Henry's results offer some very tangible insight about where different bulletin user types might be challenged and what user segments could be worthwhile targets for new awareness campaigns. Now, the objective of Abby Morgan's project is to learn as much as possible about how recreationalists perceive and use the danger scale based on additional questions we had in our survey. So let's quickly look at some of her key results. As we know from several studies, the severity of avalanche hazard grows somewhat exponentially with the danger scale. This chart from Jörg Schweitzer's recent publication on the danger scale nicely illustrates how the increase in avalanche activity from one level to the next increases as we go up on the scale. Now, to examine participants' perception of the danger scale, we designed a question with sliders that allowed participants to indicate what range of severities they associate with different levels. We then used a latent class regression analysis to identify typical patterns in participants' responses. We found in total 7 distinguishable patterns, but I'm just going to go show you 4 here. Just about half of the sample looked at the danger scale as a straight up linear scale with non-overlapping ranges. Another 13% perceived the scale to be fairly linear, but with a wider range for considerable and moderate. Approximately 20% believed that the danger scale has more of a convex shape, with the differences between levels decreasing as we go up on the scale. And only 6% actually thought that the scale has a concave shape similar to what is shown in Jörg's chart. Interestingly, the group that identified the correct shape was rather random and not associated with higher levels of training or experience. Now, perception is just one thing, but even more important is how recreationalists integrate the danger rating into their decision-making process. To examine this question, we straight up asked our participant how they used each danger rating level, and we gave them 4 different response options. At this danger level, I go primarily based on the danger rating. I go mainly based on the danger rating, but also check other info. At this level, avalanche problems and forecast details are the basis of my decision. And at this level, the danger rating alone prevents me from going into the backcountry. Here is what we found when looking at the sample as a whole. 91% of the sample stay at home at extreme, and 62% stay at home at both high and extreme. Turns out that these are exactly the B's and C's who rely most heavily on the danger scale for their decision-making process. So if this is the case, does it really make sense to have separate levels for these 2 conditions? About a third of the sample interpret low as a green light for going into the backcountry without checking any additional information, and only 5% do the same thing as moderate. So while Anne's work first pointed out who relies on the danger scale, Abby's study gives more detailed insight into how they use the scale and how the scale could be changed to make it easier for them to use. Now, to finish up, I want to briefly present some results of Katie Fisher's study, who's currently looking at how the presentation of avalanche problem location information affects people's ability to use this information. To examine this question, we conducted another online survey last spring where we gave participants bulletin scenarios with 2 avalanche problems and asked them to rank the provided routes according to their exposure. We presented the location information in 3 different ways. In the Canadian style, with elevation and aspect information in separate graphics. In the US style, with each problem being presented in a separate aspect elevation rows. And in a new style, where all the information was combined into a single graphic. Participants were randomly assigned to one of these 3 presentation formats, and each of them completed 4 ranking tasks with different routes and avalanche conditions. In the end, we also asked participants about their personal preferences for the different presentation formats. We then used a number of regression analysis to isolate the effect of the presentation format on the correctness of participants' route rankings, how long it took them to complete the task, and how much they liked the presentation format. And drum roll, please. The US graphic clearly came out on top, with the new style in second and the Canadian graphics at distant third. Everything else being the same, participants who were presented with the American graphic were faster and made fewer mistakes. After we controlled for people's familiarity with the different graphics, the American graphic was also liked the most by far. Our analysis clearly shows that presentation really matters. Having to combine elevation and aspect information requires considerable mental effort that leads to more errors. Now, there is much more to these studies than what I'm able to present here today, but I hope it gave you a decent overview of our recent efforts. I also hope that my presentation was able to highlight how we can combine qualitative and quantitative social sciences with established theories to contribute to avalanche safety in a tangible way by establishing relevant frameworks, identifying existing challenges, and explicitly testing the effectiveness of possible interventions. To finish up, I would like to share a few overarching take-home messages that I feel have emerged from our research. It is well known in the risk communication research community that having a good understanding of the target audience is critical for designing effective communication tools. In addition, good risk communication is a two-way street. While we have something to share with recreationalists, we should also do our best to learn from them about what works and what doesn't. Our challenge is that our target audience is quite diverse, and there is a range of bulletin use practices out there that use the various parts of the bulletin in different ways. Now, it's important that the design of the different bulletin parts is targeted towards the users who need those parts the most. In other words, the danger scale is not just an entry point to avalanche bulletin information in general, but it really needs to work for the Bs and Cs who use the scale as their primary decision aid. With more and more people heading into the backcountry, the communication tools that speak to the lower level user will become increasingly important. Another point I would like to make is that combining the available information into meaningful decisions is a really challenging task that requires continuous practice and feedback. But getting this feedback is really difficult due to the wicked nature of the avalanche environment that Andrea already pointed out yesterday. The comments we get in our surveys really highlight that participants really like our exercises, and they're hungry for training opportunities and feedback that tells them whether they get things right. While recreationalists typically take 1 or 2 avalanche safety courses in their backcountry careers, they regularly interact with the bulletin. I therefore think that the bulletin has tremendous potential for avalanche awareness education if we look at it as more than just a conditions report. Integrating meaningful exercises could provide recreationalists with condition-dependent training opportunities, and at the same time offer forecasters with almost real-time information about whether users are getting the message they're trying to convey. I really strongly believe that social science can really help to make this happen, but it has to be systematic, grounded in established theories, but also applied and focused on practical and actionable insight. To finish, my team and I would like to thank everybody who contributed to this research. And if there's some time left, I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you so much for that, Pascal. As always, very interesting work. I feel super fortunate to get to work actually in the field, face-to-face with a lot of end users of Avalanche products. And I'm often struck at the biases that I have and the disconnect between something that I think is kind of obvious and then the way the end user interprets that information. So I think it's really important research that you're doing. And I'm glad to have the insights from you and our team so we can work to make those better products. I'd like to open the floor to questions now. I wonder, Brent, do we have anybody with the hands up feature?
Yes, we have a couple people from the floor. We're going to start with Brian Lazar. Please go ahead, Brian.
Pascal, as always, thanks for this really useful work. So it was neat to see some new stuff here, and it seems to point to that both the bulletin as a whole and the danger scale specifically requires that the users be trained and educated on how to use these things. And I wonder if that's a failing of the system. In other words, should we be focused more on presentation to make these things more self-evident, to require less training? I guess that's the question. Do you see one of these as driving the train? In other words, do we need to do a better job educating the users, or do we need to focus more on designing these things to make them self-evident? Is the fact that they require training a failing on our part?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I think this is a really useful question, and I think I don't think we can rely on the fact that people will be motivated to take courses. And so I think we should really try hard to make these things as self-explanatory as possible. There's no reason for us to make it more complicated than it really has to be. And so I think us listening to these end users and better understand how they use these tools, and then think about how can we sort of bridge that gap the best possible way is a really important step. I think though, like if people then are trying to do more advanced outings, then I think the onus is on their part to get that training to be able to do that. But I think at the entry level, we should really try to make it as self-explanatory as possible.
Thanks, Pascal. I still struggle with how we get there, but I appreciate the work. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Brent, who do you have for us next?
Next up, we have Stuart Rude. Go ahead, Stuart.
Stuart.
Hello, Stuart Rude. You'd have to unmute yourself if you have a question. All right, looks like Stuart may be having some difficulties. Oh, it looks like he disappeared. May have been a mistaken hand up. Our next person in the queue there is Jenny Lowe. Go ahead, Jenny.
Yes, Jenny Lowe from Tahoe, first-time participant. Pascal, would you share with us briefly in Anne's phase 1 study, what's her approximate sample size and distribution of the 5 user type? And then the other part of the question is, given there were dates listed under Anne and Henry's work, does that mean they're published already as compared to those that are in preparation?
Yeah, so you asked about the sample size of Anne's study, is that correct?
Yes, correct.
Okay, so Anne and Henry, they conducted 48 qualitative interviews, and we really made a big effort to have a wide range of people. So we really had all of the different user groups in there. Later in the online surveys, we also try to recruit as wide of a sample as possible, but these online surveys are always sort of skewed towards more top-end users. But nevertheless, we had I think we had more than 200 Bs in our online sample. So still a fairly substantial sample size. In terms of whether this research has been published, yeah, you can go onto our website at avalancheresearch.ca and you will find both Anne and Henry's master thesis, which you can read. In addition to that, they've also published shorter articles both in the Canadian Avalanche Journal and TAR, so the Avalanche Review as well. So in there you will find sort of 2 to 3 page summaries of their results.
Thank you very much.
Let's take one more from the hands up queue, and then maybe we'll take one from the chat box.
Excellent. We have one more from the queue. It would be Sean Proctor. Go ahead, Sean.
Hi.
Can't really hear you there, Sean.
Yeah.
All we get is your first word, yeah, and then you muffle out.
Okay.
I'm sure, Sean, that's 3 for 3. Try unmuting yourself one more time and see what happens.
One more time. Hear me?
Very faintly.
Chat box.
I'm sorry, Sean, maybe you can type that in the chat box and we can reach over there for you and give it a go.
All right, I'm going to take one from the chat box. Zach says, Pascal, have you integrated any kind of online monitoring into these studies, such as the amount of time each user spends on the forecast page, what parts of the page they spend the most time on, etc.? Potentially broken out by the typology of the user?
Yeah, we have not. I mean, that would really sort of require working directly with avalanche warning services and actually sort of directly work with them and integrate these kind of monitoring things into their website. We've simply asked how much time people spend on different bulletin parts, but I can't give you sort of the detailed results here from the top of my head. But I think it would be a very useful thing to do in the future to really see what people use almost in real time.
Right on. We have another one from the chat box. Jason asks, as an end user, education became the key in beginning to learn how to interpret and apply the problems. I've often wondered if a glossary of terms and buzzwords would help end users move from B to C or apply the problems better in a way that would make a difference in decision making in the field. I think Colorado has begun to do this and it's been a big help. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I totally agree, especially at those lower levels. I think getting people more familiar with the terminology is an important part. I also know that Avalanche Canada is working along the same lines. So I think many Avalanche warning services have realized that this is an important part, and I definitely think it helps.
Awesome. And maybe if you have time for a 30-second answer for this one, Pascal, it'll be our last. Sean says, you showed 91% choose no-go with extreme and 62% for both high and extreme. That seems to be statistically significant, yet you mentioned the two ratings could be combined.
Yeah, so those 30% that still go out at high primarily use the avalanche problem information to make that decision. And so in some ways, it's those higher end users that look at more advanced information anyway, and we can probably convey that condition at that level. So in some ways, let's potentially focus the danger scale towards the lower end users, and then we can use the other things to communicate to those higher end users. So I think we can potentially split that message up. That would make it easier for the low end users to use the danger scale.
Thanks so much for that, Pascal. And you may be able to follow up with a few extra questions in the chat box. Thanks, really appreciate your work.